Good afternoon, and thank you so much for having us and giving us the opportunity to present our work on a reproducibility workshop that we hosted at the National Library of Medicine, where Lisa and I both work within the Office of Strategic Initiatives over at NIH. And so I just wanted to start by giving you an overview of what exactly this workshop was and what our motivations for running it were. It really began with a sort of thought experiment, asking what can we learn by trying to reproduce published research? And the genesis of this idea came from my own work as a graduate student, as a bioinformatics researcher before I came to NIH. And I wound up during the course of my PhD getting scooped 5 times, which I think is a record. I hope it's a record. I wound up doing a sort of meta-analysis, comparing the different papers that had scooped me to see how reproducible they were, how well they agreed with one another. And I found the experience to be extremely informative, and thought that perhaps there could be some benefit to adapting this sort of process of trying to really get our hands on the work of reproducibility in order to teach how we can better facilitate more reproducible research. And so the goal of the workshop was to bring together NIH researchers within the intramural research program to, over the course of 3 days, have them work to reproduce papers. And as they were working on these reproductions, we would teach them or give them a sense of the tools research, as well as the National Library of Medicine's data resources for bioinformatics, since the papers that they worked to reproduce were bioinformatics ones. The second goal was for the participants to understand how to incorporate these tools into their own research practices after the workshop concluded. And finally, we wanted to also give them, our sort of pie in the sky idea was to give them a path towards a deliverable in the form of an executable notebook or a publication that said, this research that we worked to reproduce either could be reproduced or couldn't, and here's why. And in the course of hosting this workshop, we also wanted to, from Lisa and my perspective, get a sense for how we might begin to think about a curriculum around reproducibility, as well as how researchers are approaching reproducibility in practice. And by getting a sense for how they were approaching it, it might help us identify some low-hanging fruit to promote reproducible research practices. So in addition to having this workshop, we consented the participants into a sort of ethnographic study to understand how they were approaching reproducibility. And we wanted to talk a little bit more about what exactly we learned. So before I turn it over to Lisa, I thought I'd share the structure of how this workshop operated. So as I mentioned, it was a 3-day workshop for 25 intramural NIH researchers. And we hosted this in 2 iterations. So one, I believe, was in the spring and then later in the fall. And they worked in 5 teams to reproduce bioinformatics papers. And we checked to make sure that the underlying data were available in NLM-hosted repositories. On the first day, we gave them a primer on open science and reproducibility to sort of motivate why they were here and what they would be learning. And then we also gave them 3 30-minute tutorials on executable notebooks using Jupyter Notebooks, version control using Git and GitHub, and containerization using Docker. And on the second and third days of the workshops, they worked in groups in a codeathon style. And we went around and chatted with them about what their experiences were like. And then at the end, we had them share out the progress they made and any sorts of lessons they learned. And so here I will turn it over to Lisa to tell you about the takeaways that we took away from this exercise.
Thank you, Maryam. Next slide, please. So I think the biggest takeaway, and one that was really quite surprising to me, is that in 2 rounds of this workshop, a total of 10 papers, no papers were successfully reproduced. When we originally started planning this, I remember thinking, like, I don't know, like 3 days for this workshop's kind of long. Like, aren't they just gonna like get the code and reproduce it, and that'll take an hour, and then what? And that was not the case at all. So it was very, very eye-opening, I think, for us and all of the participants to see just how difficult it was to reproduce the papers. And we I think got some insight into some reasons for why that is. Next slide. So I think big takeaway here is that reproducibility is not trivial. It's not a simple thing to make a paper reproducible. And there were a lot of issues that sort of contributed to that. One is missing underlying data. So the data, simply is not there. And of course, without data, it's very difficult to reproduce anything. Another issue is missing software and tools. So not having the code shared, not having the software available in order to rerun the analysis in the way that the authors originally did. Even when people did provide software and tools, often they weren't adequately documented or described. So things like, what are the parameters that you used when you ran the code, or what version were you using? These sorts of things that are pretty minor details, but they're really important to ensuring that you can actually reproduce the work. And then another issue that we saw was workflows that were inadequately described or difficult to follow. There was one paper in particular that I was really, I was impressed with the amount of stuff that they shared. They had this like really complicated workflow that had something like 80 different R scripts, and it had all these different data files that went into it. But with all of that, they didn't really explain how all of that fit together. So even though they had really done some work to make all of this available, it wasn't really documented in a way that allowed anyone to reproduce it. Next slide. So what can we do about this? One of the things that I think we found in this is that peer review could probably go a long way in helping to ensure that papers are at least more reproducible than they are now. So having some sort of minimum standards for peer review and ensuring that those things are actually checked could be helpful. A few of the things based on what we saw in our workshop is, checking to see that the raw data are actually available. So, this could be something that would be part of the peer review process that, the reviewer goes to see, like, do I actually see the data there? Is it as described? And that would be, something that could be part of that peer review process. Also, something that could easily be incorporated into peer review is, just to make sure that all software and tools are described and have details about things like what version did you use, what parameters did you use to run the software. And then finally, like having, assuring that the raw data are available, assuring that the underlying analysis tools are made readily available, whether that is I have shared my code in GitHub, or even if you've used a proprietary tool that, somebody would be able to locate that thing and find it and rerun your analysis in the way that you did. So thinking about some of this in peer review, I think would be really helpful. And I think there's also a need for, sort of educating, people that are writing these things. One of the things that was a really big takeaway for me personally out of this workshop is that I really changed the way that I wrote in my own research about, making sure that I talk about what version of R I'm using, making sure I specifically mention all of the packages that I'm using. So, educating the authors on, what are the sort of basic minimum, standards for reproducibility, because one of the things that we really found was that, authors were not doing this because they didn't want their papers to be reproduced. Many of the, several of the teams reached out to the original authors and told them what they were doing and asked for assistance, and the authors were more than happy to help. So I think it's not, ill will on the part of the authors. It's just that they don't know how to do this. And so education and training for the authors, I think, could be helpful as well. Next slide. So another issue is that there are still a lot of different ways to interpret or define reproducibility. What is a good minimum bar for what's reproducible and what's not? So some of the questions that go into that are things like, do we need the raw data, or do we want the data that's been processed and ready for analysis? There's sort of value of both, which should be shared. What is the sort of minimum for reproducibility? Another thought is it adequate for, maybe I don't have your script, you didn't share it, but maybe I can re-engineer it or reproduce it. Several of the teams did that. Okay, they described doing XYZ. We don't know exactly how they did XYZ, but here's how I would do XYZ, and wrote the code that way. So is that adequate for reproducibility? I would say no. Another issue is recreating the actual computing environment versus using an environment that's close enough. So one of the things that was talked about during this workshop was containers, and the idea of using things like Docker or Singularity to containerize workflows and data and share that. Something like that gets a lot closer to the original software and computing environment in which the analysis was run. So something like that is obviously going to be much more reproducible than something where you don't have that kind of really good recreation. Another sort of bar that one team met for reproducibility was they couldn't reproduce the general conclusions, but at least they could reproduce a figure. So there were parts of it that they could reproduce, even if not the whole paper. So, is that adequate for reproducibility? So these are, I think, some questions that, we need to think about, just even understanding what is the minimum standard for reproducibility that we want to aim for. Next slide. And I think that goes back to you, Maryam.
Yeah. So that last bit that Lisa shared was really interesting for us to observe, because even though we did try to prime the workshop participants with definitions around reproducibility, the ways in which they interpreted some of those criteria or expectations really varied. And when they weren't able to do a successful full reproduction, they lowered the bar for themselves in different ways that I think were really informative and interesting for us to see from a sort of education, advocacy, and outreach perspective. And so given the many ways that we can interpret definitions or requirements or expectations around these aspects of reproducibility, we think it's really important to develop clarity and consensus around these expectations, that those could go a really long way. And so it's especially great that these conversations are very much underway, particularly in forums and communities like at this conference, that are thinking so deeply about how we educate for reproducibility, so that we're building these habits, these consensus-driven definitions and frames of thinking throughout education, rather than sort of retroactively trying to correct for habits that have been entrenched. And again, we do want to highlight that despite this lack of consensus, the researchers that whose work the participants tried to reproduce were very much open to communication, as Lisa mentioned earlier. So some teams reached out to the corresponding authors, and the authors responded within hours, suggesting again that the lack of reproducibility is not in many cases the result of bad faith, but perhaps just lack of awareness around how to do reproducibility well. And so the good news is that this workshop gave us some ideas for opportunities and solutions that I will turn to Lisa to discuss.
Yeah, so like I have mentioned previously, I think that some sort of minimum standard or even a checklist for peer review could be really helpful. Obviously peer reviewers are already asked to do a lot of volunteer work, but I think having a little bit of guidance to help them do some review that would speak to some of this could be really helpful. I think there's also a very large role for data librarians and other types of librarians in research teams to assist with this. I think it's really very helpful actually to have someone who's not a part of the research team to be able to contribute to the paper, to, sort of, see some of the assumptions that people are making and encourage them to actually write it out. Longer term, it could be helpful to have some community consensus around what are these minimum expectations for reproducibility? What should a paper be able to do? And then how do we build that into existing research curricula? So getting this information to learners early on in their career so that they can do this successfully as they continue and progress in their scientific career. So that concludes our presentation. And I don't know if we have time for questions.
We do have time for questions. We did not receive any in the Q&A, but I have a couple for you, if that's okay. Well, first of all, of course, you mentioned something that is dear to my heart, which is the role of librarians and libraries in the whole area of reproducibility and data management, data science in particular. And I was wondering if you could comment a little bit more on what you see as the role of libraries, especially maybe around the idea of setting some of these standards for how we preserve and store data and code that would be necessary for reproducibility.
Yeah, I think that there's absolutely a role for librarians in doing that. And I think that there's a real need in the scientific community, and I think not necessarily a lot of existing expertise. And so I think that would be very welcome. And so at more of a sort of like campus or institutional level, I think that there's certainly opportunities for librarians. And I don't think you necessarily even have to be like a data librarian. I think in a lot of ways, reproducibility is a scholarly communications problem. And so having, an understanding of, what should be included in order for a paper to be reproducible you don't necessarily have to be a scientist to do that. If there are clear minimum standards for things like, did you include the version? Is the raw data available? Those are things that, again, I think it can actually even be helpful for someone outside of the research team to come in and look, because it's a person with a fresh set of eyes. They don't necessarily have like the assumptions in their head of what the research team does. So I think that librarians can be a real benefit to research teams in that regard.
I appreciate that. One of my other questions as I was listening to you talk was really about the new NIH standards around data management. And I was wondering, from a non-representative of the NIH point of view, how those might help to inspire more reproducibility in the published research that the NIH helps fund.
Yeah, I mean, certainly increasing reproducibility is very much a goal of that policy. There's certainly other, reasons why it's useful to manage and share data, but I think that a happy side effect of that will be that papers and research do become more reproducible. And I hope that when people are now required to do some of this, because it's a policy, it's not just good to do, I think that will really benefit science. I don't know, Maryam, if you wanted to add anything to that.
Yeah, so I mean, putting on my former researcher cap, I was doing genomics research at the time that the genomic data sharing policy was rolled out. And suddenly I had all of these data sets that I had sort of accumulated over the course of the first 3 years of my PhD that I had very poorly managed, that I suddenly had to share. And they were all, poorly named, and just me trying to guess, one FASTQ file from the next. And so I think the idea is getting researchers to think about these questions around data management and sharing at the start of the research process should better position them so that they don't have to, make sense of tens to hundreds of files after publication, the way that I had to sadly do.
Both for those great perspectives. We did receive one question, and this will be our last one. Do you think that reproducibility challenges like the ones that you had in this workshop are a good tool for getting researchers more deeply engaged with these issues and practices overall? And do you have any recommendations on how someone might set one of those up?
I would say, yeah. I mean, I think, like I said, I even just like being at the workshop and not even being a participant, like it would dramatically change the way that I write papers. So I think it was really a learning experience.
Yeah, and I think something that was really great to hear in the share outs at the end of the 3 days was researchers saying, "Oh gosh, I realized that none of my papers are reproducible." So rather than placing blame or wagging the finger at these researchers whose work they couldn't reproduce, they looked inward and saw, well, actually, everything I've written would not meet these standards either. And so hopefully going forward, they can work this into their own practices.
Just thank you both so much for sharing. And Lisa and Maryam, I'm sure will be around if you have any additional questions.